In 1977, a consortium of 51 Detroit corporations built the largest privately financed development in American history. 7 black cylindrical towers rising along the Detroit River, 5.5 million square feet, 73 stories at the tallest point. A construction cost of $337 million. In 2024, the company that has owned it for nearly 30 years announced it would tear most of it down. The reported cost of the demolition and replacement plan reaches $1.8 billion. That is more than 5 times what the building cost to construct in nominal dollars. It cannot be imploded. The Detroit River is on one side. Live infrastructure runs underneath. The tower that is being preserved is structurally connected to the towers that are coming down. The only way to remove the Renaissance Center is by hand, one floor at a time, over a period of years, by a team that has to calculate the building's stability after every panel is cut. The reason the demolition is so expensive is not greed, and it is not mismanagement. The reason is that the building was deliberately designed in 1973 to be impossible to destroy. It was designed to survive an angry city. And in 1977, when it opened, it succeeded so completely that it has now outlived its own usefulness and made its own removal one of the most expensive engineering projects in modern American real estate. In July of 1967, the city of Detroit erupted. 5 days of riots, 43 deaths, more than 2,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. The fires were visible from the suburbs. When the smoke cleared, the white business community of Detroit largely decided that downtown was no longer a place worth investing in. Capital fled, department stores closed. The riverfront, which had been the city's industrial spine for a century, started to empty out. Henry Ford II decided this was unacceptable. The grandson of the original Henry Ford pulled together a consortium of 51 Detroit corporations and committed to building something that would force the city back to life. The project would sit on the Detroit River, directly south of the Central Business District. It would contain offices, a hotel, restaurants, retail, and a parking structure large enough to serve all of them. It would be financed entirely with private money. And it would be designed by John Portman. Portman was an unusual choice. He was an architect from Atlanta who had built his career on a particular kind of project. He designed self-contained, inward-facing complexes. Hotels with massive atriums where the public street was something to be excluded, not embraced. His earlier work in San Francisco and Atlanta had been criticized by urban planners for treating cities as threats rather than contexts. To Henry Ford II in 1973, this was not a criticism. It was the job description. Portman delivered exactly what was asked for. The Renaissance Center, as he designed it, was a citadel. 7 cylindrical towers arranged around a central hotel. The 4 office buildings flanking the hotel each rose 39 stories. The hotel itself climbed 73 stories and became, briefly, the tallest hotel building in the Western Hemisphere. The complex sat on a massive concrete podium that elevated the entire development above the surrounding street grid. Earthen berms wrapped the base, cutting the complex off from Jefferson Avenue. The ground floor entrances faced inward, into a private atrium, rather than outward, onto the city. Pedestrians who wanted to enter from the street had to climb stairs, cross the berms, and find one of a small number of guarded entrances. Construction took 4 years. The Renaissance Center opened in 1977 at a cost of $337 million. In modern dollars, that is well over $1.5 billion. And by every architectural and engineering measure of its time, it was an extraordinary piece of work. The thing that made the Renaissance Center look like a fortress is also the thing that made it function like one. Each of the 7 towers is built around a reinforced concrete core. These are not the slender bundled cores used in most modern skyscrapers. They are thick-walled cylindrical shafts, 2 to 3 feet thick at the lower levels, designed to carry not just the building's vertical load, but to resist lateral forces from wind and seismic activity without significant deflection. In a typical modern office tower, the floors are supported by a combination of a slender interior core and a perimeter frame of steel columns. The Renaissance Center was different. The perimeter of each tower also carries significant structural load, and the floors are connected to the core through deep, reinforced concrete slabs rather than the lighter steel decking common in commercial construction. The result is a building that behaves more like a single, solid, concrete object than a frame of beams and columns. The towers do not bend in the wind the way modern skyscrapers do. They resist. The hotel at the center of the complex is even more aggressive. Its core walls are among the thickest reinforced concrete shear walls in any American building of its era. The 73-story structure does not sway perceptibly even in high winds off the Detroit River. Hotel guests on the upper floors have always commented on how still the building feels at altitude. That is not an accident. That is the design. Below ground, the engineering becomes even more dramatic. The Renaissance Center sits on reclaimed riverfront land. The foundation system has to bridge the gap between the load of 7 cylindrical towers above and the variable soil conditions below. Deep concrete mats and piles are driven through soft material to bedrock. The podium that the towers sit on connects all 7 foundations into a single structural unit, distributing load across the entire complex. There are not 7 buildings here. There is one continuous structure with 7 vertical projections. Add to all of this the materials that defined 1970s construction. Asbestos in the insulation and fireproofing, lead in the paint and pipework, polychlorinated biphenyls in some of the original electrical systems, mercury switches, fluorescent ballasts containing toxic compounds, all of it embedded into the concrete and steel of a complex the size of a small neighborhood. Every one of these decisions made sense in 1977. Every one of them is now a problem. By the early 1990s, the Renaissance Center was struggling. The fortress design that had been a selling point in 1977 had become a liability. Downtown Detroit had not recovered the way Henry Ford II had hoped it would. The complex's inward-facing entrances and elevated podium had isolated it from whatever street life did exist along Jefferson Avenue. Restaurants in the atrium failed, retail tenants left. The hotel at the center of the complex struggled with occupancy. By the middle of the decade, the entire Renaissance Center was underleased and underwater on its debt. In 1996, General Motors bought it. The purchase price was approximately $73 million. That is less than a quarter of what the complex had cost to build less than 20 years earlier. The math was extraordinary. A 5.5 million square foot riverfront complex, less than 2 decades old, designed by one of the most recognized American architects of the 20th century, had lost more than 3/4 of its value in nominal dollars. GM bought it for less than the cost of a single mid-size office tower in most American downtowns. The plan was straightforward. The automaker would consolidate its global headquarters from the various scattered Detroit area buildings it occupied into a single iconic location. The Renaissance Center would become the face of the new General Motors. To make that work, GM committed to a renovation budget that eventually exceeded $500 million. The goal was to undo as much of the fortress as possible. The berms at the base of the complex were partially removed. The street-level entrances were redesigned and made larger. A new glass winter garden was built along the Detroit River, finally connecting the complex to the waterfront it had ignored for 20 years. The interior atriums were reorganized. Wayfinding was redone. A central pedestrian spine connected the towers in a way the original design had not. The renovation was an architectural and operational improvement, but it could not change the underlying structure. The reinforced concrete cores were still there. The thick floor slabs were still there. The continuous foundation system that bound all 7 towers into a single structural object was still there. GM had bought a building designed to be hostile to its own city and spent $500 million trying to make it friendly. The skin changed. The skeleton did not. The Renaissance Center worked as General Motors headquarters for almost 25 years. At peak, 12,000 GM employees occupied the office towers along the Detroit River. The complex anchored the city's east riverfront. The renovation had at least made the building functional. And then the pandemic arrived. Office occupancy across American downtowns collapsed in 2020 and never fully recovered. The Renaissance Center was no exception. By 2022, GM's office towers in Detroit were running at a fraction of their pre-pandemic occupancy. Conference rooms sat empty. Entire floors were dark on most weekdays. The automaker began evaluating its long-term real estate footprint. The result was almost certainly going to be a reduction in space. The question was, what kind of reduction? In April of 2024, General Motors announced its answer. The company would relocate its global headquarters out of the Renaissance Center. The new location would be the Hudson's Detroit Tower, a development rising on the site of the demolished Hudson's department store about a mile to the northwest. The Hudson's Detroit Tower is a project of Bedrock, the real estate development company controlled by the billionaire Dan Gilbert. GM would not just leave the Renaissance Center. It would partner with Bedrock to decide what to do with the building it was vacating. The plan they announced together was startling. 2 of the 4 office towers flanking the Central Hotel would be demolished. The remaining structures would be preserved and converted to a mix of residential, hospitality, and ground-floor retail. The riverfront podium that John Portman had designed in 1973 to elevate the complex above Jefferson Avenue would be partially or fully removed, finally reconnecting the site to the Detroit River at street level. The redevelopment would require public funding alongside private investment. Reported total costs for the demolition and replacement plan reach $1.8 billion. Almost immediately, the question started. How exactly do you demolish 2 39-story reinforced concrete towers that are physically connected to a central hotel that is being preserved, with the Detroit River on one side, with occupied infrastructure on the other, with Jefferson Avenue carrying tens of thousands of cars a day 50 feet from the work zone, and with the People Mover elevated rail system looping around the entire complex on tracks that cannot be shut down? The answer turned out to be more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. Standard skyscraper demolition in the United States usually means one of 2 methods. The first is implosion. A team of engineers calculates where to place precision charges throughout the structural frame, weakens the columns and core in a specific sequence, and brings the building down into its own footprint in a matter of seconds. The famous Las Vegas hotel demolitions are implosions. The Stardust, the Riviera, the Tropicana, buildings the size of full city blocks reduced to rubble in under 15 seconds. The second method is mechanical dismantling from the top down. A high-reach excavator or a series of cranes work floor by floor, removing structural elements piece by piece. This is slower, but allows for the recycling of materials. It is required when the building is too close to neighbors or critical infrastructure to risk the seismic energy and debris field of an implosion. The Renaissance Center cannot be imploded. 3 reasons make implosion impossible at the site. The Detroit River sits directly to the south. Any uncontrolled debris or seismic energy from an implosion would have to be managed near actively used waterways and the Riverwalk pedestrian path. The Central Hotel Tower, which is being preserved as part of the redevelopment, is physically connected through the podium and adjacent structures to the office towers being demolished. You cannot bring half of an interconnected concrete complex down with explosives without affecting the other half. And the surrounding occupied infrastructure, including the People Mover elevated rail loop, Jefferson Avenue, and the GM tunnel that runs underneath the Central Business District, leaves no margin for error. That means dismantling. And dismantling a building designed to be a fortress is a different exercise than dismantling a building designed to be efficient. The reinforced concrete cores have to be cut, not collapsed. Each section requires hydraulic shears, diamond wire saws, and controlled removal sequences calculated by structural engineers who have to verify that the remaining portions of the building are still stable after every floor comes off. The thick concrete floor slabs cannot be dropped onto the floor below. They have to be sectioned and lowered. The post-tensioned cables embedded in the slabs have to be released in the correct order to prevent the stored energy in the concrete from releasing dangerously. Then there is the hazardous materials abatement. Asbestos throughout the original insulation and fireproofing, lead in the paint and pipework, polychlorinated biphenyls in some of the original electrical equipment that has not been fully replaced, mercury switches. Each of these requires specialized removal, full containment of the work area, air monitoring, and disposal at certified hazardous waste facilities hundreds of miles away. The abatement work alone for a complex of this size and era can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars before a single piece of structural concrete is cut. Then the foundation work. The concrete podium that ties all 7 towers together has to be partially removed to reconnect the riverfront to the street grid. The piles and mats below the demolished towers have to be either removed or capped. The reclaimed riverfront land underneath has to be stabilized for new construction. And all of this work has to happen alongside the preservation work on the central tower that is staying. The combined dismantling, hazardous materials abatement, podium removal, and riverfront site preparation are the reasons the reported project budget for the Renaissance Center redevelopment approaches $1.8 billion. The building was designed in 1973 to resist every force that could be brought against it. Almost 50 years later, the force being brought against it is a team of engineers trying to take it apart. It is winning. Both things are true. The Renaissance Center was an engineering marvel of its era. 7 concrete towers rising out of reclaimed riverfront land along the Detroit River, 5.5 million square feet of mixed-use space, anchored by a 73-story hotel that was briefly the tallest in the Western Hemisphere. A structural system so robust that the upper floors do not perceptibly move in a high wind. A foundation so deep and continuous that the entire complex behaves as a single object rather than 7 independent towers. A monument to private capital's willingness to invest in a city that had nearly burned itself down. The largest privately financed development in American history at the moment it was completed. And it was also a building designed to be hostile. A fortress that turned its back on the river it sat next to. A complex that elevated itself above Jefferson Avenue and made pedestrians climb berms to enter. A symbol of corporate Detroit's defensive posture toward the city it claimed to be saving. A structure whose every engineering choice was driven by the idea that downtown Detroit was a threat to be excluded, not a context to be joined. A building so over-engineered that the engineering itself is now what stands between the city of Detroit and the riverfront the rest of the world has been visiting for 50 years. The thing that made the Renaissance Center invincible is the thing that makes it expensive to remove. The reinforced concrete shear walls that resisted wind and earthquake also resist demolition. The thick floor slabs that allowed massive open offices also resist being lifted out. The continuous foundation system that bound the 7 towers together also binds the demolition crew to a project that has to be done by hand, one element at a time, over a period of years. It costs as much as $1.8 billion to take down a building that cost $337 million to put up. Not because anyone made a mistake, because John Portman did exactly what Henry Ford II asked him to do in 1973. He designed a building that could survive an angry city. It survived, and now the city is finally taking it back.